Avoidants don't fear commitment, they fear loss of control. That distinction matters because it changes the entire story people tell themselves about why an avoidant pulls away. Avoidants don't avoid love, they don't wake up wanting distance for the sake of distance. What they avoid is dependency. The moment connection starts to feel like a tether instead of a choice to an avoidant nervous system. Dependency registers as danger. It feels like giving up autonomy, emotional self-governance, and the ability to retreat when overwhelmed. So when commitment is framed as closeness, merging, or we before they feel internally stable, their instinct isn't to lean in. It's to protect their sense of control. For avoidance, control is not about dominance. It's about safety. Many learned early that relying on others led to disappointment, intrusion, or emotional cost. So they adapted by becoming self-contained. Independence became their regulation strategy. That's why commitment only becomes possible when it doesn't feel like surrender. When love appears to require emotional exposure before they've learned how to stay regulated inside intimacy, the system reacts, not logically, somatically. Their body reads vulnerability as destabilizing, not connecting, and no amount of reassurance can override a nervous system that feels flooded. This is where the first misunderstanding happens. People assume avoidance pull away because the relationship is wrong, the partner is asking too much, or the bond isn't real. But most of the time, the retreat has nothing to do with you being unsafe. It's about them feeling uncontained inside closeness, emotional conversations, expectations, and even gentle bids for reassurance can feel like pressure when they haven't built the internal capacity to stay present while exposed. So they create space, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to regain internal equilibrium. Commitment for an avoidant doesn't begin with promises. It begins with the absence of threat. They commit when closeness doesn't feel like a trap, when autonomy remains intact, and when love doesn't come with an implied loss of self. That's why they often seem more available when nothing is being asked of them. The moment commitment is framed as obligation instead of choice, their defenses activate. Control, to them, is the difference between feeling alive in connection and feeling erased by it. This doesn't mean avoidants are incapable of deep love. It means love must feel non-invasive before it feels safe. They need to experience intimacy that doesn't demand immediate emotional access, constant reassurance, or premature vulnerability. Until then, commitment feels like standing on unstable ground without an exit. And no one steps forward when their body believes they're about to fall. Understanding this reframes the narrative. Their pullback isn't a verdict on your worth or the connection's validity. It's a signal that autonomy still equals safety in their system. And until they learn that closeness doesn't require self-abandonment, commitment will always feel like a risk they can't afford. Not because they don't care, but because control is the only stability they've ever known. The more you need clarity, the less clarity they can offer. Not because they're withholding on purpose, but because emotional pressure overwhelms the very system they use to stay regulated. Avoidants don't commit when they're being asked to define, explain, or reassure before they've built the internal tools to do so. They commit when nothing in the relationship demands emotional labor. They haven't learned how to give. The moment clarity becomes a requirement, instead of a shared unfolding, their nervous system reads it as demand. And demand feels like threat. Deadlines, labels, and where is this going? Conversations are often framed as healthy communication, and in secure dynamics, they are. But with avoidance, these moments don't create readiness. They expose the absence of it. When pressed for answers they don't have, avoidants don't suddenly access insight, they feel cornered. And when someone feels cornered, they don't move forward. They pull away. Not because the relationship is wrong, but because they're being asked to perform emotional certainty they don't possess. This is where many people unintentionally apply pressure without realizing it. Wanting clarity is human. Wanting to know where you stand is reasonable. But for an avoidant, the need for clarity itself becomes the destabilizing force. It shifts the relationship from connection to evaluation, from presence to performance. Suddenly, love feels like a test they're failing, and retreat becomes the only way to stop the internal alarm. Avoidants commit when the emotional environment is calm, predictable, and non invasive. Calm doesn't mean distant, predictable, doesn't mean boring. It means there are no sudden demands for depth they haven't consented to, no urgency to define what hasn't settled inside them yet. When their relationship allows space for ambiguity without punishment, they can stay. When it requires immediate articulation of feelings they're still trying to understand, they shut down. What looks like avoidance is often overwhelm. When emotional conversations come with urgency, timelines, or implied consequences, the avoidant nervous system goes into protection mode. Their silence isn't indifference, it's a freeze response. The clarity you're seeking is inaccessible to them in that state, not because it doesn't exist, but because pressure blocks access to it. Commitment for avoidance grows in low pressure environments. It emerges when they feel free to arrive at decisions internally before voicing them externally. When they don't feel responsible for stabilizing someone else's uncertainty, they can finally feel their own. Ironically, the less they're pushed to define the relationship, the more likely they are to choose it. The hard truth is this: emotional pressure doesn't speed up readiness, it exposes the limits of someone's capacity. If someone consistently retreats when clarity is needed, it's not a timing issue, it's a capacity issue. And no amount of patience or restraint on your part can substitute for emotional skills they haven't developed yet. Understanding this doesn't mean silencing your needs, it means recognizing that commitment can't be negotiated out of pressure. If clarity only exists when you stop asking for it, that's not alignment. That's a nervous system trying to escape demand. And that distinction tells you far more than any label ever could. They stay when they don't feel responsible for your happiness. That line alone explains why so many people feel confused inside avoidant dynamics. Avoidants equate being needed with being trapped, not because they lack care, but because need activates an old survival equation in their nervous system. If someone depends on me, I will lose myself. For them, being needed doesn't feel like intimacy. It feels like obligation, pressure, and emotional weight. They don't trust themselves to carry, so commitment becomes possible only when the relationship doesn't position them as the regulator of someone else's emotional world. Avoidants commit when they believe you are self-sourced, that you can self-soothe, self-direct, and emotionally stabilize without leaning on them as your anchor. This isn't about cold independence or emotional detachment. It's about perceived freedom. When they sense that your sense of worth, safety, or happiness is tethered to their availability, their system tightens. Love starts to feel like a responsibility they didn't consent to. And when love feels like responsibility, retreat becomes the only way to breathe. This is why avoidants often pull back right after moments of closeness. Vulnerability creates connection, but it also creates impact. They suddenly feel the weight of mattering, and to someone who equates impact with burden, that weight is terrifying. So they create distance, not because the bond is false, but because the responsibility feels too real. Commitment doesn't grow in that moment, it stalls. Ironically, the moment you stop centering them is often the moment they feel safe enough to stay. When your life doesn't shrink around their availability, when your emotional stability doesn't rise and fall with their presence, something shifts. The relationship stops feeling like a dependency structure and starts feeling like a choice. And choice is the only environment where an avoidant can relax. They don't want to be needed. They want to be chosen without consequence. This is where many people misinterpret avoidant behavior. They believe pulling back emotionally, needing less, or focusing on themselves is a strategy to get the avoidant to commit. But the truth is simpler and harder. It only works if it's real. Avoidance can feel when autonomy is authentic versus performed. If independence is a tactic, it still carries pressure. If it's genuine, it removes it. And pressure, even unspoken, is what they're always escaping. This ties directly into why distance makes desire safer for avoidance. They feel love most clearly when it doesn't ask for anything. Emotional intensity without space overwhelms their nervous system. Too much closeness too fast creates a sense of engulfment where the relationship feels like it's closing in before they've had time to orient themselves inside it. Distance in this context isn't disinterest, it's a buffer that allows desire to exist without immediate responsibility. When there is space, avoidance can feel longing without panic. They can miss you without feeling trapped. They can want you without fearing what the wanting will demand of them. Distance gives their nervous system room to metabolize emotion instead of defending against it. Without space, intensity feels like invasion. With space, it becomes attraction. This is why avoidants often report feeling more connected when they're apart than when they're together. In absence, there's no demand to perform intimacy, no pressure to respond correctly, no expectation to meet emotional needs in real time. Desire becomes internal and safe. They can feel it without being accountable for it yet, and that's often when commitment begins to form, quietly, privately, without announcement. But this creates a painful paradox for the partner. The very things that help the avoidant feel safe, independence, space, emotional self-sufficiency, can feel like self-erasure to someone who wants mutuality and presence. When closeness only works at a distance, the relationship becomes asymmetrical. One person adapts to create safety, the other grows only when nothing is required. The truth is this: avoidants don't commit when they feel needed or engulfed. They commit when love feels optional, spacious, and non-invasive. When desire doesn't come with urgency, when connection doesn't demand regulation, and when the relationship doesn't hinge on their availability. Understanding this explains behavior. It doesn't prescribe sacrifice. If commitment only becomes possible when you stop meeting, stop asking, and stop wanting proximity, that's not safety. That's accommodation. And while distance may make desire safer for them, you still get to decide whether that kind of love is safe for you. They don't choose from pressure, they choose from freedom. For avoidance, commitment is not a response to persuasion, persistence, or emotional effort. It's a response to autonomy. The moment they feel pursued, convinced, or subtly cornered into staying, resistance appears. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets pressure as a loss of agency. And when agency feels compromised, the instinct is to pull back, reassert independence, and restore control. This is why power dynamics matter so much. With avoidance, commitment only emerges when the dynamic feels neutral, when neither person is chasing, convincing, or waiting to be chosen. If they sense that your patience, loyalty, or understanding is being offered in exchange for a future promise, it creates an invisible debt, and avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional debt. Owing someone love, reassurance, or commitment feels suffocating. Even unspoken expectations can feel like a trap. When the power dynamic tilts, when one person wants more, waits longer, or adapts further, the avoidant feels it immediately. The relationship stops feeling like a mutual choice and starts feeling like an obligation they'll eventually have to repay. That's when distancing behaviors increase. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-protection. Freedom to them is not optional. It's the prerequisite for staying. Avoidants commit when they believe staying is genuinely their decision, not something earned through your sacrifice, not something negotiated through time, not something they owe you because you've been understanding. When love feels clean, without leverage, without guilt, without emotional accounting, they can relax into it. The absence of pressure allows desire to surface naturally instead of defensively. This is also why ultimatums, emotional appeals, or after everything I've done conversations often backfire with avoidance. Even if the message is valid, the delivery reinforces the very dynamic they fear, being cornered by expectation. They don't respond by stepping up, they respond by stepping away. Pressure doesn't activate commitment, it activates escape. Neutral power doesn't mean emotional detachment, it means equality of choice. Both people are free to stay or leave without consequence or punishment. When that freedom is real, not performative, avoidance can finally feel safe enough to choose. And choice is the only place where commitment holds for them. This connects directly to why stability matters more than chemistry. Intensity attracts avoidance. Sparks, novelty, and emotional charge can pull them in quickly. But intensity alone doesn't sustain commitment. In fact, too much emotional volatility increases internal stress, making closeness feel dangerous. Avoidants may chase chemistry, but they commit when life itself feels manageable. Stability lowers the baseline of threat in their system. When work feels steady, routines are predictable, and life isn't chaotic, their nervous system has more capacity, and capacity is everything. Commitment doesn't fail because of lack of love, it fails because of lack of bandwidth. When they're overwhelmed by external stress, relationships become the first thing they prioritize, not because they matter less, but because they demand emotional presence. This is why avoidants often commit later in life or after certain milestones. Career stability, financial security, and established routines create an internal sense of control. With fewer unknowns, love stops feeling like one more variable they have to manage. Stability doesn't make them less avoidant. It makes commitment feel survivable. Chemistry excites them, but stability soothes them. And soothing is what allows them to stay. When life feels chaotic, even a healthy relationship can feel like too much. When life feels structured, commitment becomes something they can integrate instead of defend against. This can be painful for the partner who feels the connection deeply during uncertain or transitional phases. You may experience their withdrawal, not because the bond weakened, but because their life stress increased. The timing feels personal, but it often isn't. Commitment is easier for them when fewer systems are demanding their energy. The truth is this: avoidants don't commit because of passion alone. They commit when freedom is preserved and stress is reduced, when the relationship doesn't tip the power scale or add pressure to an already overloaded system. When love feels like a choice they can make, not a weight they have to carry. Understanding this gives clarity, but it also draws a boundary. If commitment only happens when you minimize your needs, neutralize your desire, and wait for life to calm down for them, that's not partnership. That's accommodation. Stability may keep them, but you still get to decide whether that stability includes you fully or only at a distance. That makes them comfortable. They understand love when it's gone. That truth feels brutal, especially if you were fully present, consistent, and emotionally available while the relationship was still intact. But for many avoidants, connection itself is not the environment where attachment becomes conscious. When closeness is constant, their nervous system stays in regulation mode through distance, distraction, or emotional minimization. The bond exists, but it's muted. It doesn't register with weight. It doesn't feel urgent. Love for them becomes background noise, present, but unfelt. Avoidants often don't experience the full impact of attachment until loss introduces contrast. Distance removes the buffer they use to manage intimacy. Without the option to pull away while still keeping access, the attachment finally has space to surface. Absence creates clarity, not because it manipulates them, but because it removes their primary defense, emotional avoidance through proximity, without presence. When you're no longer there to be half held, the reality of what they had and what they didn't fully engage with finally land. This is why commitment sometimes appears after you stop chasing. Not because walking away is a strategy, but because space is the only environment where avoidance can process emotion without overwhelm. When you're close and asking for more, they feel flooded. When you're gone and no longer asking, they can feel the nervous system relaxes just enough for reflection to happen. They replay conversations. They notice the absence. They feel the quiet weight of what they avoided. This often creates confusion for the person who stayed. You showed up when it mattered. You were there during connection, and yet clarity comes to them after you leave. It can feel unfair, even cruel, but it's not about timing as a game. It's about capacity. Avoidance process attachment internally and privately, not in real time and not relationally. Loss removes the immediate demand to respond, perform, or reassure. And in that stillness, emotion can finally move. However, this is where many people get stuck in false hope. They interpret post-loss realization as proof that love was real and therefore worth waiting for. But awareness does not equal readiness. Feeling love in absence doesn't automatically translate into the ability to sustain it in presence. Many avoidants can name their feelings only when there's no expectation attached to them. When reconnection becomes possible again, the same defenses often return. That's why understanding this point requires restraint. Distance may allow them to feel, but it doesn't teach them how to stay without deeper work. Commitment that appears after loss is often fragile. It's reactive, not integrated. It comes from missing, not from capacity. This is where healing changes the timeline. Unhealed avoidants don't commit. They stall. They linger in ambiguity. They delay decisions. They keep connections just close enough to avoid loneliness and just distant enough to avoid vulnerability. Stalling isn't a conscious tactic. That's a nervous system strategy. When someone hasn't learned how to regulate inside intimacy, delaying commitment feels safer than choosing or leaving. Therapy, self-awareness, and nervous system regulation can genuinely shift everything. When avoidants learn to tolerate closeness without losing themselves, the entire pattern changes. They can feel love in real time. They can respond instead of retreat. They can commit during connection, not only after loss. Healing doesn't make them less independent. It makes independence flexible instead of defensive. But without intentional work, the timeline doesn't move forward. It loops. Relationships start, deepen, slightly stall, create distance, end, and then replay in memory. The avoidant may feel regret, nostalgia, or longing, but not enough internal safety to choose differently next time. Love exists, but capacity doesn't catch up, and no partner can bridge that gap for them. This is the hardest truth for people who love avoidance. Love alone is not the missing piece. You cannot love someone into regulation. You cannot be patient enough to replace therapy. You cannot wait quietly enough to build emotional skills on their behalf. Commitment isn't delayed because you didn't do enough. It's delayed because their nervous system hasn't learned how to stay open under relational stress. When commitment comes only after loss, it tells you something important. It tells you that presence overwhelms them more than absence. And while that explains behavior, it also defines limits. A relationship that only feels safe when you're gone cannot grow in a healthy way. Healing is what determines whether realization becomes action. Without it, insight remains internal and commitment remains hypothetical. With it, the timeline shifts from someday to now, from reflection to choice, from missing to staying. So if you're waiting for an avoidant to finally commit after distance, ask the deeper question: have they done the work that allows closeness to feel safe? If not, their awareness may deepen, but the outcome likely won't change. Understanding this isn't about giving up hope. It's about placing hope where it belongs, not in loss, but in capacity. If it hasn't lined up by now, it's not about patience. That sentence cuts through one of the most painful illusions people hold in avoidant dynamics: the belief that a little more understanding, a little more time, or a little more self-control will eventually tip the relationship into commitment. But timing is not a neutral force. It's not something that magically corrects itself if you just endure long enough. When months or years pass without movement, clarity, or forward momentum, the issue isn't pacing, it's capacity. If you've been understanding, supportive, and consistent, and nothing has shifted, the truth is simple and uncomfortable. The conditions they need to commit aren't present inside them. Readiness is internal. It doesn't come from the quality of your love, the safety you provide, or the sacrifices you make. It comes from nervous system regulation, emotional skill, and the ability to tolerate intimacy without retreating. And no amount of external patience can manufacture that. This is where many people confuse compassion with self-delay. They see avoidance as fear and fear as something that can be soothed with enough reassurance. But reassurance doesn't build capacity. It often masks the problem long enough for it to resurface again. Time doesn't heal what's not being addressed. It simply extends the same pattern. Waiting becomes a way to postpone the grief of accepting that someone may care, but still not be able to choose you. Timing myths keep people stuck. They just need more time. They're not ready yet. Once life settles down, things will change. But readiness isn't something that suddenly appears when circumstances improve. People who can commit even under imperfect conditions. People who can't stall even when everything else is aligned. If time alone were the answer, progress would be visible by now. Stalling often disguises itself as hope. The relationship doesn't end, but it doesn't deepen either. You stay in the in-between, interpreting silence as thoughtfulness and distance as processing. But when nothing moves, it's information. Lack of movement is the answer. Not because they don't care, but because caring isn't the same as choosing. And this leads to the most important shift: their commitment conditions are not your assignment. Understanding avoidant attachment is meant to bring clarity, not obligation. It explains behavior. It does not require you to wait, adapt, or shrink yourself into something more palatable. Insight is not an instruction to endure. When people learn about avoidance, they often turn it inward. They become quieter, less expressive, more patient, more self-contained. They tell themselves they're being secure, when in reality they're disappearing. They reduce needs, delay conversations, and lower expectations in the hope that love will finally feel safe enough for the avoidant to stay. But safety that requires your absence is not safety, it's suppression. If commitment only becomes possible when you disappear, detach, or stop wanting, that's not alignment. That's self abandonment. Alignment doesn't require you to erase your desire for closeness. It doesn't ask you to stop needing reassurance or connection. It doesn't demand that you regulate alone while someone else remains unchallenged. Real alignment meets you where you are. It doesn't ask you to leave yourself behind. This doesn't mean avoidants are villains. Many are deeply caring, thoughtful, and self-aware. But awareness without action doesn't create partnership. You can understand someone perfectly and still not be able to build a life with them. And staying in a dynamic that requires constant self-adjustment isn't love, it's endurance. The hard truth about timing is this: when it's right, it moves. Not perfectly, not without fear, but forward. When it's wrong, it stalls, and no amount of patience turns stagnation into progress. Waiting doesn't make you noble, it makes you unavailable to someone who could actually meet you. What this means for you is not to harden or withdraw, it's to return to yourself, to stop interpreting delay as destiny, to stop outsourcing your future to someone else's healing timeline. You are allowed to want clarity. You are allowed to want consistency. You are allowed to want commitment without apologizing for it. Understanding avoidant attachment can bring compassion, but compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. You don't need to prove how safe you are by enduring uncertainty. You don't need to shrink your needs to earn stability, and you don't need to disappear to be chosen. If someone needs you to stop wanting in order to stay, they're not choosing you. They're choosing comfort. And you deserve a relationship where commitment doesn't arrive after you've given up parts of yourself to make it possible.